At first glance, ancient Greece appears as a philosopher's paradise, with flowing wine, open debates, and groundbreaking ideas. Its citizens enjoyed freedoms and pleasures most of us can barely imagine, yet life remained degrading, brutish, and short for slaves, women, and children. Join us as we unveil the dark side of ancient Greece, and why you probably wouldn't survive there for very long. Viewer discretion is advised, as some content in this video may be offensive or disturbing. The creators of this video neither endorse nor condone the actions of the subjects featured. The war culture. The ancient Greeks lived in a near constant state of warfare and conflict. This bellicose culture was deeply ingrained, with battles being commonplace occurrences that impacted all levels of society. Despite the philosophical, artistic, and democratic achievements of ancient Greek civilization, violence was never far from the surface. In the archaic age of Greece, from around 800 BCE to 500 BCE, warfare was characterized by seasonal battles between various city-states, competing for regional dominance and resources. Rather than having full-time professional armies, military duties fell upon the male citizenry who acted as part-time soldier farmers. These amateur armies were mostly comprised of hoplites, armored infantrymen equipped with shields, spears, and swords. During the summer months when farming activity was lower, men would take up arms and conduct regional campaigns aimed at territorial conquest or revenge for past defeats. The average ancient Greek citizen therefore lived a dual existence, farmer by summer, warrior by winter. This created an environment where warfare became an almost casual endeavor rather than a series of extraordinary events. By one estimate, between 700 BCE and 350 BCE, there were only 7 years when Greece was completely at peace. Death and violence touched nearly every family, either directly on the battlefield or through the economic impact of continual strife. In many ways, war was also seen as a display of honor and strength. City-states like Athens and Sparta gained tremendously in regional prestige each time they emerged victorious. This incentivized further warfare as a means of glory-seeking by Greece's redoubtable warriors. Territorial expansion was also a major motivation, as conquered lands meant more natural resources, trade routes, and economic bounties from which to derive power and influence. The Draconian Laws. The legal code instituted in Athens by the lawmaker Draco around 621 BCE is rightly considered one of history's most tragically harsh systems of justice. Known today simply as the Draconian Laws, this legal code prescribed shockingly severe punishments for even minor transgressions, and death for many trivial offenses that would today result in no more than small fines or brief jail terms. The Draconian Laws were instituted during the crisis for legal reform in Athens. The rule of law was scant and arbitrary, with no consistent punishment for specific crimes. This resulted in endless cycles of retaliation and blood feuds between various aggrieved parties seeking personal vengeance. The aristocratic class was also known to bend the rules to suit their fancy, further corroding any sense of equity, transparency, or fairness in the justice system. To address the growing disquiet, the government appointed Draco, an Athenian aristocrat born in the 7th century BCE, to draft Athens's first definitive code of law. What Draco produced shocked the nation, and echoes still today as a byword for merciless authoritarianism. His code prescribed the death penalty for over 30 different crimes, ranging from theft, assault, and murder, all the way to seemingly harmless acts like idleness, laziness, and even losing one's job. There was little consistency or sense of scale in the punishments matched to their corresponding misdeeds. Exile, property seizure, and torture were also deployed extensively for transgressions where death was not mandatory. The implementation of draconian laws made life exceedingly difficult for commoners, and that's precisely why you wouldn't survive life in ancient Greece. Records show that Draco's code reflected a harsh authoritarian worldview where law and order eclipsed humanitarian concerns. The cruelty inherent in the code led to it being described as being written not in ink, but blood. Yet Draco appeared sincerely convinced that excessively harsh laws were the only surefire way to maintain stability and deter criminal activity in Athens. When questioned about the severe provisions, Draco is said to have responded that he believed small crimes deserved death and he had no harsher punishment for more serious ones. The draconian laws have been relegated to the darkest chapters of history, yet the term persists to this day as a descriptor for exceedingly harsh authoritarian measures. Child mortality and infanticide. Devastating rates of child mortality plagued ancient Greece due to limited medical knowledge, constant wars, unsafe urban infrastructure, and economic woes afflicting poorer parents. Records indicate perhaps half or more of newborns perished before age 10 from diseases like pneumonia, gastrointestinal infections, or mosquito-borne malaria. Obstetric techniques remained crude, with many mothers dying from loss of blood. Babies who survived the traumatic birth process entered harsh, unhygienic worlds without modern vaccinations, exposing them to an array of lethal ailments that snatched young lives swiftly. Malnutrition also stunted development, causing irreparable harm. Widely practiced infanticide targeting girls or physically weak infants also culled countless numbers seen unfit for work or marriage. Unwanted babies would be abandoned on hillsides or outside fortification walls where nature ran its course. Some city-states like Sparta implemented organized eugenic programs, judging newborns, managing bodily imperfections for termination. Deadly cosmetics. In the ancient world, Greek women went to remarkable lengths to enhance their beauty, using an alarming array of toxic concoctions that ended up severely damaging skin and health. This tragic vanity was fueled by intense cultural pressure to achieve standards of physical perfection centered around flawless, blemish-free white skin, along with strong unibrows seen as highly desirable. At the heart of the most popular beauty products available in ancient Greece was a deadly chemical we now firmly associate with toxicity and pollution: lead. Referred to as a wonder ingredient by Greek beauticians in 500 BCE, lead was considered key for creating smooth, bright, and allegedly youthful facial features that aligned with contemporary beauty ideals for women. Popular items included lead oxide powder mixed with vinegar into a paste and slathered liberally all over the face, chest, shoulders, and arms. Once dried, this paste tightened the skin for a temporary lifting effect, while lightening any darker patches when scrubbed off. Seemingly magical transformations that understandably proved irresistible. More fashion-forward ladies opted for kohl, an early prototype mascara laced with heavy traces of lead, antimony, and ash that prominently outlined eyes with a striking dark hue. Others chose lead nitrate hair dyes said to impart a desirable golden sheen. Most famous perhaps was the unibrow pencil called miltos, which prominent ladies would use to carefully paint on an artificial conjoined eyebrow. The Greeks felt strong unibrows increased facial symmetry, closest to the mathematically perfect ratios proportioned by renowned scholars like the philosopher Pythagoras. Indeed, many upper-class women who unfortunately lacked a natural unibrow would conspicuously pencil on bold brow ridges, using miltos to simulate this supposedly enviable feature. Of course, continual usage of such products delivered horrifying results, utterly contrary to the flawless, goddess-like splendor promised by unscrupulous merchants. The most heartbreaking cases involved female children whose mothers regularly applied lead oxide solutions or kohl around their eyes as early as age 5 or 6. By age 17, formerly bright-eyed youths were often balding, blind, and disfigured, destined to live as tragic recluses or be cast out on the street due to their repulsive mien. Yet so institutionalized were these inhuman beauty practices that they persisted for nearly 1,000 years across ancient civilizations from Egypt to Rome to Greece until well into the early centuries of the Common Era. City of slaves. Slavery was astonishingly widespread throughout ancient Greek society, with some city-states having populations that were comprised of over 80% slaves and servile classes. By conservative estimates, between the 8th to 4th centuries BCE, slaves represented nearly 40% of the total population in places like Athens and Sparta. They served in every area of life, working as domestic help, mining laborers, skilled artisans, farmers, oarsmen, construction crews, and a multitude of other capacities. Some slaves even functioned as business managers, state clerks, and municipal assistants, handling huge sums of money and governing responsibilities on behalf of their masters. Most slaves were war captives, meticulously trained so they could be resold for immense profits in thriving slave markets across Greece. Many barbarian tribes specifically targeted neighboring societies not for territorial conquest, but for the prime human plunder that could be sold to traffickers supplying major Greek cities with slaves. Other common avenues for enslavement included piracy raids, kidnappings, birth to enslaved parents, debt bondage, and abandonment or sale of unwanted children. With so many inflows, all levels of ancient Greek society became utterly reliant on this vast, forced labor pool that lacked even the most basic civil rights. The living conditions of slaves ranged from dismal to dehumanizing. House slaves tasked with domestic duties sometimes received better clothing and shelter, but most worked long days under the beating sun in fields, quarries, or mines where malnutrition, injury, disease, and abuse were common. Owners could legally beat, brand, or kill their slaves with little consequence, a chilling reminder of their expendability and worth being not much higher than livestock. Family units were routinely dismantled as slaves were sold to different masters and shipped around ancient Greece without any consideration for preserving marital, fraternal, or parental bonds. While uprisings and resistance movements did occur, they were brutally suppressed. Athens itself survived a massive revolt in the 413 BCE, known as the Great Slave War, where rebel slaves occupied the countryside before being crushed by military force. Spartacus led a slave army that rampaged across Roman Italy in 73 BCE before their defeat saw thousands crucified. Class inequality. Perhaps the most bitterly ironic feature of ancient Greece is how the very people who pioneered revolutionary concepts like democracy, voting rights, and equality under the law also casually oppressed the vast majority of inhabitants under a brutal totalitarian regime. Greece, exemplified by beguiling images of white marble pillars and introspective philosophers, was actually an apartheid oligarchy, propped up by a vast slave population with precious few rights. Compelling visible evidence lies in how even superbly sophisticated cities like ancient Athens around 400 BCE were physically segregated into vastly unequal zones, mirroring the great disparities in wealth and legal protections between social classes. The Acropolis and nearby agora quarters, with their splendid temples and colonnaded courts, were exclusively for native-born male citizens who comprised a mere tenth of the population. Foreign resident aliens and freed slaves lived in the hilly areas just outside the main city blocks. Then came industrial zones of potters, smiths, and workshops packed with slaves. Beyond lay abandoned mines and quarries worked by the most wretched slaves condemned to dark, unsafe tunnels, and the ever-present threat of cave-ins and lashings. The born privileged band of citizens ruled Athens as a totalitarian council, barring women and slaves from any role in civic affairs and government. Male citizens readily abused their position to accumulate fortunes through corruption, foreign plunder, and the labors of their vast bondsman population. Athens itself only built its navy and funded the remarkable Periclean monuments using tribute extracted from so-called allies or outright colonies. A deadly plague. One turning point in ancient Greece's history came during 431 to 404 BCE in the form of a terrifying plague that eviscerated the population of Athens, contributed to its loss in the Peloponnesian War, and marked the end of that city's political and cultural golden age. Today, historians believe this mysterious disease originated somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa and traveled through Egypt, Libya, and Persia before finally arriving in overcrowded and unsanitary Athens to claim as many as 100,000 lives, up to one-third of the city-state's population. The plague first surfaced during the second year of the Peloponnesian War, a ruinous 27-year conflict between Athens and its rival Sparta that ravaged ancient Greece. Eyewitness accounts from contemporaries like the historian Thucydides describe a disease that began with an unusually high fever, followed by inflammation of the stomach, eyes, and mouth, with a rash rapidly spreading across the skin. Victims coughed up blood as their organs failed, with most patients dead after 7 or 8 days of torment. Doctors were mystified, and the disease spread rapidly across the densely populated city, whose residents huddled behind protective walls against the marauding Spartans. Corpses piled up in the streets, the government temporarily collapsed, and trade and agriculture came to a standstill. Funeral pyres burned night and day, but could still not keep pace with the death count. Aside from the profound emotional and social impacts of seeing a full third of their fellow citizens perish in writhing agony, the plague also critically wounded Athens in its existential war against rival Sparta. Already struggling to protect rural areas from Spartan raiding parties, the plague's heavy toll on the Athenian navy proved catastrophic. Crew complements were devastated, including the death of one commander, forcing the previously undefeated fleet to swing onto the strategic defensive. Sparta gained the naval initiative, and began raiding vital Athenian grain convoys from the Hellespont region, further weakening the city's resistance. By 404 BCE, an exhausted and demoralized Athens surrendered to Sparta, its walls pulled down and its maritime empire forfeit. Though some scholars argue Sparta's ultimate victory owed more to errors by the Athenian leader Alcibiades, the plague's shocking lethality coupled with its disruption of military operations nonetheless proved key. The era of Athenian dominance built on cultural, economic, and naval supremacy thus ended, only to be followed by Spartan political infighting and decline. But for a brief, incandescent moment, there had been an Athens that produced Socrates and Sappho, Praxiteles and Pericles. It took only a tiny germ, carried silently on desert winds, to rob Greece of that grand legacy. Doomed medicine. The medical knowledge possessed by physicians and healers in ancient Greece appears almost magical compared to the primitive approaches that preceded the Greeks. Treatments gradually evolved beyond supernatural rituals to become examinations of diet, lifestyle, and some surgical procedures we would easily recognize today, like setting fractures and extracting shrapnel. However, life-saving concepts like contamination, anatomy, and pharmaceuticals remained utterly alien, dooming Greek medicine to a perilously incomplete understanding of trauma and disease. This meant few ailments beyond broken bones or gaping wounds could be treated effectively in antiquity. Confronted with afflictions like infections, cancer, mental illness, or organ failure, Greek doctors, considered the most advanced in the Mediterranean world, had shockingly little to offer except wrong-headed guesswork and placebos. Bleeding patients was absurdly common, using cups, leeches, and incisions, aimed at supposedly balancing the body's four humors of blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Imbalances in these humors were believed to cause most illnesses. So bloodletting to re-establish harmony made intuitive sense to physicians using pre-scientific approaches little better than ritual witchcraft. Herbal treatments and dietary changes were also prescribed for maladies ranging from skin conditions to neurological disorders, even though trial and error guessing dominated over any systematic verification process for efficacy. Critical concepts of disease transmission, surgical disinfection, and pharmacological testing simply did not yet exist, although Greeks correctly perceived clean water and environment as health positives. While the shortcomings of ancient Greek medicine seem glaring in hindsight, it's worth noting even the wisest minds can outrun available facts. Doctors certainly helped individual patients given prevailing limits in knowledge, creating a historical basis upon which medical science slowly but persistently built over succeeding centuries to become the formidable healing system saving lives today. Discrimination against women. Women occupied a profoundly unequal position in ancient Greek society, facing systemic barriers that severely curtailed personal liberty and civic participation. Male guardians, whether fathers, husbands, or even sons, exercised lifelong control that relegated women to little more than legally mandated house arrest, functioning as childbearers and homemakers. This crushing disenfranchisement was upheld through social norms and written laws, literally establishing women as not quite human dependents under male custodianship. From birth, females received less investment in their upbringing. As adults, they could not inherit wealth, own property, or engage in commercial transactions. Forced into arranged marriages as teenagers to much older men, wives became socially isolated within their husbands' households, often with limited ability to even exit their homes without male permission. Denied education or careers, politically silenced and demoted to domestic drudgery, many wavered helplessly before abuse by male family members, and death offered little respite. As hypersocial centers of masculine identity, things like the Agora Forum, gymnasiums, and banquet symposia simply remained off-limits to women. Unsurprisingly, female points of view come to us faint as ghosts across the millennia compared to loud male voices. What does survive includes sad remnants like curses invoking the Furies to avenge battered wives, along with the tragedies of Medea and Antigone, highlighting female defiance against oppression. Small wonder some women like the brilliant Aspasia became concubines of the rich and powerful like Pericles, to escape confinement as some citizen's uncherished wife. Others perhaps turned to the liberation of the hetera courtesan's calling, traveling between cities as cultured companions of influential men. Even the famous poetess Sappho may have sought liberty on cosmopolitan Lesbos, safe from the strictures of masculine Greek society. Of course, democracy emerged not from abstraction, but from the living reality of whatever bodies populated a city's streets homes, and shops, their fluid hopes, anxieties, and self-worth embodied through time. How skewed then was any ethical evolution founded upon raw injustice against half its own people? Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. The ancient Greeks were known for administering some of history's harshest punishments, and this severity is precisely why you wouldn't survive life in ancient Greece. Take, for instance, phylakismos, or phylak, a punishing practice involving the use of a pillory or stocks. This brutal contraption, constructed from wood or metal, restrained individuals by securing their head and hands, subjecting them to public shame and potential mistreatment. Those unfortunate enough to be placed in the pillory not only endured public humiliation, but also faced additional physical suffering, such as lashings or beatings. This form of retribution extended beyond common crimes like theft or adultery, often becoming a tool for political suppression. What are your thoughts on the punishments of this bygone era? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Debt bondage. The disjointed boom-bust cycles of ancient Greece spawned an economic plague called debt bondage, where impoverished citizens literally lost their freedom by taking loans using their persons as collateral from unscrupulous moneylenders. Default meant enslavement with the debtor, and sometimes their family hauled off in chains potentially for decades to toil, paying off endless compounding interest, far exceeding the sums originally borrowed. In bad harvest years when grain prices spiked, or during wartime disruptions of trade, struggling small-scale Attican farmers often desperately pledged their own bodies on credit to purchase seed stock in hopes the next season's yield or olive press would square accounts. Many tenant cultivators renting temple lands also sank onto this quicksand by borrowing to make fixed land rent payments. Penalties were harsh under Draconian Laws. Defaulting debtors were sold by creditors into chattel bondage abroad to recover some money. Irredeemable debts could even pass from father to son, condemning whole families to multi-generational slavery. By 600 BCE, these dark practices made debt slavery endemic across Attica, a slow strangulation of the free yeomanry that once flourished as soldier citizens of Athens' storied democracy. Relief arrived during the constitutional reforms of 594 BCE, instituted by the statesman Solon, allowing those hopelessly indebted to walk away from loans. Solon's famous Seisaktheia ordinance also freed citizens already enslaved for debts by forcibly repatriating them, while banning personal bondage for Athenian citizens in the future. Philosophical persecution. Among the most iconic episodes of ideological persecution in antiquity lies the trial and execution of the Greek philosopher Socrates in 399 BCE. Socrates underwent capital punishment in Athens, the great cradle of early democracy and nervous bastion defending Greek independence against Spartan militarism, for the dual charges of refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state and corrupting the youth. His sentence culminated weeks of bitter legal wrangling where Socrates justified his unorthodox beliefs before a 500-man jury in the Agora in defiance of expectations. He would beg for exile over execution. Socrates emerged as a controversial figure for dissenting against traditional Greek piety by invoking new gods and demonstrating irreverence toward mythical figures cherished in childhood nursery rhymes. As an intellectual gadfly through decades wandering Athens' streets and meditating in its shops and gymnasia, the eccentric stonemason-turned-teacher also attracted profound enmity from conservative quarters by pointedly questioning Athenian mores around obedience, ethic, power, and even sexual proclivities, striking raw nerves that sparked bitter outrage. When the political climate turned sharply authoritarian during the tense Peloponnesian Wars against Sparta, figures like the poet Anaxagoras and General Pericles, once sheltered from religious offense by public fame, fell rapidly from grace. Tarnished by military failures against the Spartans, the former student and close friend of Socrates, Alcibiades, also became a target of Athenian insecurities that soon expanded into efforts by political enemies to indict the 70-year-old philosopher himself as an irreverent mind infecting youth against parental authority. Tyranny of the 30. As a democracy successor to Solon's reforms and famed Periclean flourishing, ancient Athens valued civic libertinism and rambunctious open debate laced with wit and wisdom in equal measure. Against such traditions of outspoken assembly politics and frontier philosophy, validated by successes against monumental enemies like mountainous Sparta and the vast Persian Empire sprawled across Western Asia, injustice should presumably find short shrift. Or so idealists imagined until Athens's defeat defeat by Sparta in the Peloponnesian Wars unleashed extreme political forces that promptly extinguished the world's pioneering democratic experiment. In the aftermath of capitulation, Spartan military governors, in collaboration with prominent Athenian oligarchical houses, targeted previous democratic leaders for reprisals from exile to summary executions. Critical reformers and outspoken thinkers were also driven out, violently intimidated into silence, or killed outright. Rule by the council degenerated into brute decrees enforced by Spartan garrison overseers. This brutal tyranny of the so-called 30 lasted just 8 months from 404 BCE to 403 BCE before an exiled Athenian army managed to defeat the collaborator regime and roll back totalitarian measures. But the damage to Athens' political psyche proved deep and lasting, because for all the triumphalism of resistance chroniclers glorifying the city's liberation, far more chilling was how suddenly and sadistically these tyrants broke every sacred covenant and bloodily tortured beloved demagogues who just yesterday were citizens in fullest standing. The lesson was clear. No past service or fame spared any throat from the executioner's blade when whispering advisors poured poison into powerful ears. And the common people, alerted brutally from political slumber, reacted not with outrage but exaggerated obedience, even informing on neighbors. Perhaps the 30 tyrants' years proved mere hiccups in history books, but for those who actually endured the knocks on doors and screams from the cells, blithe democracy likely seemed less the rule in human affairs than a precarious exception. Zombies in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, belief in revenants, the dead rising from their graves to torment the living, rattled the idea of a rational, enlightened society free of superstitions. Ancient Greeks took elaborate precautions to prevent the dead from transforming into the undead creatures known as vrikolakas. These zombie precursors would then supposedly roam the countryside, seeking victims to sate their appetite for human flesh and blood. Archaeologists have discovered graves dating back to ancient Greece containing corpses weighed down with stones, amphora shards, or heavy bronze shields, presumably placed there by fearful relatives hoping to immobilize the dead. Other sites contain skeletal corpses with bronze stakes driven through ribs or inside oral cavities again, demonstrating efforts to pin down the deceased permanently inside grave sites. Tales warning about creatures named vrikolakas have also survived in scattered fragments across Greek literature. The Greeks viewed rituals like placing coins as payment for death's ferryman Charon as critical to ensuring a peaceful demise rather than a hideous half-life trapped between realms. Deformed or murdered bodies were thought especially prone to resurrection as angry zombies, so the enduring connection between revenants and Greek antiquity underscores a public terror of wrathful undead once believed as possible as Socrates or Sappho, stirring bad dreams and nightmares even in philosophy's very cradle, challenging later myths about the birthplace of Western reason free of ghosts or ghouls. The ultimate lesson here lies in humility for our ancestors, and realizing even the clearest minds cling to improbable beliefs when glimpsing death's dark horizon. The Bronze Age collapse. Sometime around the close of the 2nd millennium BCE, a mysterious cataclysm devastated nearly all the early complex societies that circle the Mediterranean basin. This enigmatic event is known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. It destroyed or fatally weakened once thriving kingdoms and empires like the Mycenaean Greeks, Hittites, Egyptians, Canaanites, and Minoans, bringing down the final curtain on the Bronze Age with violently abrupt finality. The unfolding disaster appears to have taken only a few decades between 1200 BCE to 1150 BCE. It slashed vibrant international trade, triggered huge population dislocations as refugees fled the chaos, and ushered in a dark age defined by violence, instability, and fear. Surviving written records speak of invasions by mysterious seaborne marauders, referred to cryptically as the Sea Peoples, who attacked cities throughout the Mediterranean littoral without mercy. Other accounts describe massive crop failures and droughts leading to starvation on an epic scale from Greece to Egypt. Yet what's most astonishing is how utterly many powerful civilizations were helpless before the onslaught. The Kingdom of Mycenae, famous for its masked gold death masks and labyrinthine palace citadels, was burned down with most cities destroyed or abandoned. Once prosperous Minoan Crete withered into rural insignificance, centered around subsistence farming. The Hittite Empire simply fragmented into quarrelsome microstates before also dissolving entirely. Goods that once flowed freely from workshops in Cyprus, Canaan, and Amurru stopped almost overnight. So severe was the breakdown in regional trade. In the wake of this collapse, Sweeping social transformations rippled across the early Iron Age world that emerged from the fires of catastrophe. With the great palace-centered kingdoms gone and writing forgotten, government and law returned to the village level based on family bonds and tribal oaths. At least in Greece, the collapse ushered in a dark age that lasted centuries, characterized by isolation, fear, and poverty. What exactly happened to cause this ancient version of an apocalypse remains hotly debated. Natural disasters like earthquakes, climate change, or epidemics have been suggested, and certainly would have exacerbated existing tensions. But any single explanation struggles to account for the scale and speed of the ruin visited upon so many great early societies. As scholars puzzle tirelessly over clues in buried ruins and worn clay tablets, the late Bronze Age collapse remains perhaps the ancient world's most confounding enigma, an extinction-level event that savaged the first age of empires with a suddenness that still reverberates across our history millennia later. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.